And we're 2 minutes after the hour, so this is when we're going to get started, Clint. So,
Cool.
welcome everybody. My name is Sean Wilkie. I'm the CEO of Talkatoo. We love hosting these informative webinars, and I've got a great person for you all today. Clint Latham is the president of. I'm gonna get the name wrong, Clint. I was just like,
Lucca.
I just have to Lucca, Veterinary Data Security.
Yeah.
And Clint's been in the IT industry for much of his life. He has led a very interesting career, and I don't know if any of that's going to come off in the presentation, but I'll save your thunder for you as you present. We met several years ago in the veterinary industry and became fast friends, spent lots of quality time together on the trade show circuit. And I'm really excited about today's talk to give you all an understanding of kind of the current state of technology, data security in this great profession that is veterinary medicine. And without further ado, Clint, it's over to you, man.
All right, sweet. Let me share my screen here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I always recommend, one thing I always want to start off with is time is the most important thing in the world and something that you will never get back. So please, if you have any questions, please let me know. This time, this is for you. I'm extremely grateful that you're willing to spend time with me. So if you have any questions, please interject. I'm more than happy to answer them, regardless of what it's about. Even if it's maybe an off topic we're talking about, if it's anything technology related, VetMed, I'm happy to address those questions. So today we're going to talk about what I consider to be the most important thing in VetMed that nobody is talking about, and that is the current state of cybersecurity in veterinary medicine. This is a little bit about me. My name is Clint Latham. I'm the owner and founder of Lucca Veterinary Data Security. I have over 15 years of software, networking, and security experience. I also spent way too much money to go to law school and hold a Juris Doctorate degree, even though I don't practice law. So these are a picture of my dogs. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see my two Yorkies. Unfortunately, they have crossed the Rainbow Bridge at this point. But I say that they were the greatest teachers I've ever had in veterinary medicine. The little black and tan guy, he got TCC, or transitional cellular carcinoma, and it had started in the trichome of his bladder, and it had spread to his prostate before we realized he had it. And at the time, we had a pretty bad diagnosis. It was pretty grim. I think we were given like 4 to 6 weeks before potentially it would close up his bladder and we'd have to put him down. However, I learned that with a bunch of amazing veterinary professionals, everybody from our GP to our oncologist to a nutritionist to even a local cannabis specialist here in Colorado, we were able to turn Cash's life from 4 to 6 weeks into like 16 months of really good quality of life. And actually, the cancer kind of had stopped spreading, and it was his kidneys had shut down. And I think it was basically one of the steroids that he was on that we were kind of helping to fight the cancer. So I would say we beat the cancer, and it was his old man kidneys that eventually got him. But with both of them, I think they taught me so much about the importance of just having amazing veterinary professionals in your life, and being so fortunate that I was in an industry that I was surrounded by people that could really help me. So now we have moved on from small dogs to big dogs, and the little guy on the right is my dog Odin. He is a Woodle. That's his puppy photos. He's a little bit bigger now, and he weighs about 30 pounds. So we went from 5 pounds of pure terrier to now about 30 pounds of just the most lovable dog in the world. And they just continue to teach me the importance of VetMed. So now with everything technology in the VetMed space, Cisco CEO John Chambers had a great statement. Said there are 2 types of companies: those that have been hacked and those who don't know yet that they have been hacked. And that's what we're kind of going to get into today. So this is a picture of me and my nephew at his 7th birthday. And I always like to talk about Lincoln because I remember when he was 3 or 4 years old, I was calling his dad. And to my surprise, Lincoln answers the phone. And what caught my attention is I was like, "Oh, Lincoln, like, you stole your dad's phone. Like, where's your dad at?" And he was like, "Oh, no. Like, I wanted to talk to Uncle CJ first. And so I saw that you were calling. And so I went and grabbed the iPad and stole the call so that I could talk to you first." So at a very, very young age, he already knew how devices are synced, how they're connected, and how he can leverage those tools to his advantage. So I think as we move forward, and now as the younger generation, I think in 2019, the Merck Animal Health Study said that the majority pet owner is the millennial generation. And I'm like kind of on that cusp of the millennials. So I'm kind of aging myself here, but I think by like 51 or 52%, and that's only going to grow. So I think the importance of technology is going to be, and like leveraging things like Talkatoo and all these amazing tools that are available at our disposal is going to become more important in order to serve the younger generation. But we just have to be smart about how we use these tools. We have to make smart decisions, understand how they work so we can leverage them safely. So let's get into some basic trends and statistics. Roughly every 39 seconds, a business is attacked by some form of cybercrime. 64% of companies worldwide have experienced at least one form of cyber attack over the last year. And these are all 2020 statistics. So some new data should be coming out here soon. So I should have some more of that over the last couple of years. But in 2020, this one's pretty interesting. Ransomware attacks peaked with a 423% year-over-year growth. This was specifically, and I'm not sure if anybody here had that, like we saw in VetMed, we saw moving a lot of CSRs home and having them work from home, especially if you had VoIP providers, et cetera, or so they could do callbacks and trying to reduce the amount of staff in the hospital, especially depending on what state you were and what regulations they had kind of put out around the pandemic. And so hackers knew that a lot of people were behind home routers, but had access to work networks. And so we just saw this massive spike. And then we also saw that around 94% of all malware, and malware is a term in the industry that we use for basically unwanted software. So if you ever hear anybody in the industry, if you're an IT guy, whoever throws this term around, it just means unwanted software. So it could be really anything from as benign as like ads popping up and tracking ads and trying to sell you stuff to something far more malicious like ransomware. One thing that we don't talk a lot about in VetMed, and I can't tell you how many times I've had this talk and you always have the one person in the room where it's like, oh, I could lose all my computers and it wouldn't matter. However, I think if you really use a downtime cost calculator and you put in your labor rates and missed charges and all the things that go in when you can't access your data sets, and like in this case, it doesn't matter if you're cloud-based or it doesn't matter if you're a local server-based. If you get hit with ransomware, which is the most prolific attack that we see now, you can't access your computer. Your computer becomes a basically really expensive paperweight. You cannot do anything on it. So just because you're cloud-based doesn't mean you're necessarily ransomware proof, because you can't do anything. So if you don't have a computer that functions and it has spread across your network, you have really you have $20,000 or $40,000 worth of paperweights sitting around your hospital. And so if we look at the downtime, that all the money that we're burning and the cost of paying an IT professional to clean all of our computers up, get them running again, a lot of times that downtime can be more expensive than the actual cost that the hackers are requesting. So generally, if you're not familiar with how ransomware works, essentially, is it an application that will get on one computer, and then it will spread to all of your other computers, basically locking everything out. So you have a message on your computer that says, please pay X amount in Bitcoin to this Bitcoin wallet to get the unlock key. And you can't do anything on the computer until you enter that key to quote unquote unlock it. Now, the average ransomware request across the US, across all business sizes, was $377,000. And if anybody has any idea why it's that amount, it is because in 2019, the FBI was getting so inundated with ransomware requests. So businesses were getting hit with ransomware. And if they were requesting more than $250,000, then the FBI would get involved. So we saw a lot of ransomware requests around that $250,000 mark. And so we saw a lot of requests. So the United States government decided, well, instead of trying to help people figure out how to fix this problem, we are just going to raise the ceiling. So they said, no, we're not going to get involved unless the ransomware request is at least $500,000. So now we see that request coming in just shy of that. Usually we'll look at some specific veterinary examples that we've seen. Generally, they will be on your network for 7 to 14 days. So they get an idea of what kind of money you're moving around, what kind of business you're doing. They kind of monitor everything, because once they get on the network, they have basically access to everything. And then they'll kind of judge that based on what they think, what kind of money you'll have in the bank. But yeah, we've seen $377,000 is the average, because it's just below that mark where the FBI or the federal government won't get involved. And then the downside is if you pay, you become a repeat target. And this will become more important when we look at things a little bit later. I think the AVMA, when they pushed, if anybody here is an AVMA member, in 2020, early 2020, they released their cybersecurity PLIT insurance. And I think they said at the time, because they had it out for a while, they really started pushing it because we saw this massive spike in claims. And I think their average claim at the time was 135K. That may have gone up now. I should reach out to AVMA, maybe get some updated statistics. But 3 years ago, their average claim for a cyber attack was $135,000. Market trends. So when I started this company, I was really interested because a number of people and friends and a lot of my colleagues in the tech space were like, you're crazy. Like, I don't know why you go into vet med. There's no HIPAA requirements. There aren't a lot of data requirements. We didn't have CCPA. We didn't have GDPR yet. We didn't have a lot of these. Well, we did have GDPR. We did have CCPA, but those hadn't really nothing had really kind of spread across the US yet. And so there weren't a lot of requirements, and people were like, you're crazy. You should go into human health. They basically have to pay for your services. We'll get into later why I just felt like so bad for vet med, and why I felt that somebody had to do something and to at least educate the industry as to what's going on. And the most common thing I found is when we started surveying hospitals to figure out how to, like, if this was even a problem that most hospitals even thought about, is that none of them had any idea what GDPR were. So at the time when I started the company, GDPR was basically had just gone live in Europe, which stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And CCPA was coming out in 2020. And there were some delays with the COVID pandemic, but basically is now live. And I think 16 other states, I have a link up. There's an article on my website. If you go to lucca.vet and you go to cyber news, there's an article there that will basically has a map of all the states that have adopted similar language. And CCPA is similar to GDPR, and it's called the California Consumer Protection Act. And it basically puts some more requirements on you requiring to protect PII, or personally identifiable information. A really overly simplified way to look at this, and if I put my legal hat on, this is probably a bad example because there are just so many other ways that you can get in trouble. But the easy way to think about it is, if I can get 3 pieces of data on somebody that separates Clint Latham in Palisade, Colorado from Clint Latham in, say, Sacramento, California, that's information that we now have to take reasonable measures to protect. And reasonable is a very loose term because that gives the government a lot of flexibility as to, were you reasonable, were you not? And it's kind of up to a jury of your peers to decide, and then what those fines and impacts will be. And then each state maybe are a little bit different. So most of the language for CCPA that has been spread across the US is almost verbatim of CCPA, just applies to different states. But you always want to check with your local state statutes to see what your actually required are and if there's any big difference. But basically, if I can exfiltrate a bunch of data that's personally, I can singularly point out somebody, if I can triangulate somebody based on the data I can steal from your hospital, you have to take reasonable measures to protect it, or there's a lot of fines and levies and other things that you potentially have to do if that data is compromised. What I also found is that most hospitals clearly lacked an understanding of how cyber attacks actually work. And they had no idea, again, about the data or legislation. Most people, they were like, oh, why would anybody want Fluffy's vaccination records, right? That's the general consensus and general thought that we would get. There's been a little bit of a shift in the industry. Hopefully, maybe because some of the work I've been trying to do, the soapbox I've been preaching on for the last 3 or 4 years now. Hopefully, we're starting to make some changes, but still, it's a big problem in the industry today. So the waterfall approach. I would love to say that I came up with this idea, but actually I sat on the AVMA's webinar in 2020, and they had a cybersecurity expert from, I think, the human health field that was giving a presentation, and he actually used this analogy, and so I stole it from him. But I think it's a really great idea, great way to understand how cyber attacks work. So when we were surveying most hospitals, they're like, well, why would anybody want to attack my small hospital in Iowa, right? Like, why would anybody come after me? Like, I'm nobody special. But what they don't realize is that's not how cyber attacks work. Now with AI, these things are drastically changing. So, a couple of years ago, you had to be pretty skilled. And if I was a skilled hacker and I could take the time to create a cyber attack or deploy a piece of ransomware, I wasn't going to take the time to go after one single business. I wanted to go after as many businesses as possible so that I can get the biggest bang for the buck, right? So the amount of labor it's going to go into me producing this software, I want it to basically hit as many people as possible. And so the way I'm going to deploy it is I'm going to deploy it to the World Wide Web. I'm going to deploy it to the internet. Everything is connected to the internet. And we'll look at some examples of just how being connected to the internet puts you at risk. And I'm going to look for the path of least resistance. So my software is going to go out and it's going to look for certain things that just allow me to flow downstream easier. So if I come up to your business and I come up a bunch of roadblocks as I'm trying to get into your network and I'm kind of having to swim upstream to attack you, I'm going to move on. And I'm going to go to the next hospital that basically I can just steamroll right over everything, get in and get everything that I want. So it's not necessarily that somebody's coming after your specific business, but it's generally, are you the path of least resistance for somebody to just basically steamroll all of your technology and basically get access to all your data? Now, a couple caveats. What we first saw is that I had to be pretty skilled and technical to be able to do this. Now we saw the second stage in like 2021, late 2022, we saw the growth of what we call RAS, or ransomware as a service. So like if we look at Talkatoo, software as a service, right? So Sean and his amazing team build this amazing piece of software that you pay a monthly fee for, and you get to use it and leverage it and help grow your business. Well, criminals saw this same business model and decided to deploy it for criminals. And so we had really smart developers constantly looking for the paths of least resistance, developing the tools, and then offering it to people who were willing to deploy it. So basically they'd say like, look, we're not going to charge you until you recoup money, and then we're going to take X percentage of whatever money you can exfiltrate or blackmail people from. And then that's how we'll grow our business. So we saw these ransomware as a service companies massively growing across the globe. And now with AI that has just kind of grown like wildfire, we now have AI tools that you can go in and say, hey, code me a application that will take advantage of this vulnerability. And we're seeing language models that would basically spit the code out for us. And so then I just need to compile it and then basically deploy it. So AI is drastically changing this and changing it for the worse, because now I don't have to involve another party like a ransomware as a service company. I can basically go onto one of these dark web LLMs and have it code me the tools that I need. I can compile it and then deploy them myself. So basically kind of cuts other people out. If you love podcasts, there's a great podcast called The Darknet Diaries. In this episode, Jack Rhysider was interviewing a guy by the name of Cam Carter. And this one really just like kind of blew me off my seat, because he specifically mentioned small businesses like vet hospitals, coffee shops, barber shops, hairstyle salons, restaurants, any small business that basically offered free public Wi-Fi to their customers. The short of it is that he was able to extort over 50 million. Well, the United States government says, he won't say how much he actually stole, but the United States government basically blames him for stealing roughly $50 million from small businesses. So how was he doing this with free Wi-Fi? Essentially, he would go in the parking lot, connect to the Wi-Fi, and then he had some tools that would look for the machine that was running all the credit card transactions. And basically what happens is when a credit card transaction is being processed, it holds that information in plain text for a very, very brief amount of time, maybe 1/100th of a millisecond. In plain text is all the billing and credit card information I need, and then it encrypts it and then runs the transaction and pushes it off. And so he would find the computer, say maybe you're using Front One or Reception One, whatever, or maybe you're doing Xamarin-based checkout. So he would find the computer that was doing the checkouts. He would deploy this malware. It would sit behind on the computer. You had no idea it was running. And it would just create a text file. And he would dump all of this information into a text file. And he'd let it run for a couple of days. And then he'd come back and he'd sit in the parking lot, connect the Wi-Fi, hop over to that computer, grab that text file, and then go home. And he got really good at creating fake credit cards. And so instead of selling his fake credit cards to somebody else and then letting them cash out, he's like, why don't I build my own bases or databases of credit card numbers? And so he would go home, print a bunch of credit cards with using all the information he stole. Then he would hop on a plane and fly to another state and just start hitting as many ATMs as he could with these credit cards, pulling as much cash as he could possibly catch. And then he actually made a mistake because he was still selling, I think it was fake IDs at the time. And he'd gotten pulled over and he had a box of fake IDs in the trunk, and the cops saw that. And then they basically put everything else together. And that's eventually how he got caught. But yeah, they say that he's roughly responsible for stealing over $50 million. So imagine if all of your customers came to you and then the next thing, their last transaction is at your hospital. And then all of a sudden somebody hits up your free Wi-Fi, and then you have all of your customers calling you saying they have fraudulent transactions of thousands of dollars the day after they came to you, and they start putting the pieces back together. You're left to pick up the pieces of that customer relationship because you are the ones that allowed them to essentially get compromised. So basic things we can do so that this, CAM wouldn't be able to take advantage of us. But really great podcast if you're interested in it. Search out Darknet Diaries by Jack Resider. Really great stories. He interviews a bunch of former cyber criminals, and it just kind of gets into details, but really great story. So there's a company here in Denver. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, Lockheed Martin. They make a lot of aerospace tools and weapons and all sorts of stuff, but they have an office in Denver. And I really like this because they have what they call their 7 links in the cyber kill chain. So there are basically 7 steps that we need to be able to stop an attacker at. And you don't need to basically memorize this. It's just kind of informal or slightly informative, but there, at every one of these stages in a cyber attack, we need to be able to stop them. So they're going to look to see if we're the path of least resistance. So we need to make sure those doors are closed. If they can find something, then they're going to weaponize it. So can we stop them there? And then once they weaponize it and they try to deliver it to us, can we then stop them there? And so on. So then they're going to exploit us, run the installation, community control, and then basically achieve their actions and objectives, which is generally trying to extort us for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But these are the 7 stages that a technology professional or cyber security professional thinks about in all the areas that we need to stop criminals. So a couple of industry examples. So let's talk about things that actually happen in our industry. And I think these 2 are important because when I first started the company, the other thing was like, look, like I can barely afford to have a regular IT guy help us with printer problems. Like we can rarely print from front desk back to the label maker back in the tech station. Like I can't afford to have a cybersecurity professional. But what I think is a common misnomer is that cybersecurity has to be expensive, and it doesn't. I think the biggest thing is we just have to think about it and do some basic things, which will really kind of shore up most of our gaps. And we'll talk about those later with those five simple things that you can do to protect your hospital yourself that really kind of give you the biggest bang for your buck. But here are a couple of examples that have massive IT teams, huge IT budgets, but yet still suffered millions in losses. Merck Animal Health is an interesting one because, as I talked about earlier, I talked about how you don't necessarily have to be the direct target in order to suffer millions in losses or hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses, depending who you are. And Merck is a great example of that. So in 2017, I'm sure everybody's heard, Russia and Ukraine are at war right now. Well, this is nothing new. So they've been battling each other for probably as long as the 2 countries have existed. And in 2017, the fancy bears, I think, is what the Russian government, each government has their own hacking team, and they've got a unique name that the industry uses to call them. I think it's the Russians are the fancy bears. And they were trying to figure out a way to take out the Ukrainian economy. So how do we just wipe out the entire Ukrainian economy so they can't do anything, so it comes to a standstill? And what they realize is that most businesses in Ukraine used this European version of QuickBooks. And it has a weird name, it's like We Do or something like that. And they're like, well, if we can take advantage of this QuickBooks, basically this QuickBooks style tool, this accounting software tool, most businesses are going to run it. And then we can shut down most businesses, which basically means the economy won't run. So they waited and they looked and they found a vulnerability on this software company server. And then they basically injected what we thought was a ransomware tool into the update. So on a Monday, all these Ukrainian business people come to work, and people not in Ukraine, which I think is important because IT doesn't know borders, right? It doesn't know one country from another, right? Like how easy is it for me to view a website in the US to a website in the UK? So there's no borders in technology. And so this update went out to everybody. It didn't go out to just Ukrainian companies. It went out to anybody using this accounting software. And so people got the notification, like if you're a QuickBooks user and you still use the desktop one, like you see that update, right? It's like, hey, time to update QuickBooks. You need the new tax tables or whatever. So people are like, cool, I'm gonna hit the update. When they ran the update, it ran what we call not petya. So basically it started executing this what we thought was ransomware. So it immediately wormed across the network and started locking every computer out. So in Ukraine at the time, the subway had shut down, banks were shut down, you couldn't buy food, you couldn't buy gas, you couldn't really do anything. So they basically had to achieve their objectives. Now, what was interesting is that in it is that as IT team and security teams started pulling this attack apart, it looked like it was ransomware. So it was like, well, if we can just figure out how to decrypt it, we can start getting this key out to everybody so they can unlock it. But it actually wasn't a ransomware. It had the Petya look. So before 2017, I think in 2015, Petya came out, which was the largest ransomware attack we had seen. This was masked as Petya. And so we're really good at naming things. And what we found is it actually was deleting everything across all computers. So it wasn't just encrypting the data, it was actually deleting everything. And so there was nothing to decrypt because your computer and all of your data had essentially just been deleted. And so because we're really good at naming things, we called it not Petya. So we thought it was Petya at first, but then it wasn't. And so we decided, well, it's not Petya. So that was the name that stuck. So the largest cyber attack we'd ever seen at the time was called not Petya. It was actually deleting everything. So how does this tie into Merck? Well, Merck had one computer running this accounting software, one computer. That one computer spread it to all of Merck's network, their animal health division and their human health division. It led to over $670 million in losses because of one computer. They had cybersecurity insurance and were suing. And so they got hit. The cybersecurity insurance company said, we're refusing to pay because you didn't take reasonable measures. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Like when we look at legislation, GDPR, CCPA, are you taking reasonable measures? And like, you're not taking reasonable measures. We're not paying. And so actually they were in a legal battle for the last 2 years or 4 years, because it was in 2017. So they settled the lawsuit last year. So it took them 5 years. And actually, I think it was in November of last year, the court had decided in favor of Merck, and the insurance company actually had to pay out. But it took them 5 years to recoup it. But it actually was so bad for Merck that they had to go to the United States government and say, hey, like, we need access to your emergency drug supplies to meet demand because we can't produce anything. So they were down forever. Maersk, I think is how you say it, which is like the world's largest shipping provider, was also hit, and massive shipping delays. Like things weren't getting delivered. I mean, at the time, Amazon wasn't as big. So imagine like you couldn't get anything. Because all the shipping lanes had been shut down, et cetera. So again, one computer led to over $670 million in losses. If you look at another example, MBA, and that was in the end of 2020, hit 400 clinics that got shut down and countless dollars lost because of it. And essentially, the hackers had found, NBA owned a bunch of hospitals. So let's figure out the path of least resistance, right? So how do we take advantage of this company so we can take advantage of all of their hospitals? And they basically found a tool that their technology team was using, and they took advantage of that tool. That tool then spread it to all the other hospitals, and it wiped out 400 clinics at once. So again, here are two examples, massive IT budgets, yet they still suffered a lot of losses. Now, the good news is that while this may seem really scary, you may think, well, like what can I do? There are some basic things you can do that are little to no cost. Had they been in place, if both of these companies maybe would have helped prevent some of these attacks. So let's look at some examples that we generally don't hear about, right? So like we hear about the Mercks, we hear about the MBAs of the world because they're such large companies. But what about the small hospital, right? Like what about your independent hospital? The sad thing is that happens all the time. I think if we look at the number of animal hospitals in the US, divide that by the frequency and the number of small businesses, I think the math comes out to about 1.5 veterinary hospitals per week on average experience some form of cybercrime, just based on the general statistics. Now, nobody is actually marking veterinary hospitals generally, so it's kind of a ballpark figure that I'm using just on some general data statistics and small businesses in the US. But if we look at some of these hospitals that have reached out to us, we had one that lost $40,000 from their bank account through what we call business email compromise. And so basically what had happened is, how many of you are using the free Gmail accounts, right? I'm helping out with an AHA project, and every time I'm like, hey, I need you to log into your portal, I can't tell you, like almost every day, it is xnxhospital@gmail.com, right? Well, there's very little protections around those free accounts, because if you're free, you're the product. Gmail doesn't really care if you lose your free account. They're offering the service for free. And in this case, the animal hospital's primary, like their general account got compromised. They figured out who the owner was by watching the email communication. So then they basically hopped over to the owner's account, and then from there, watched communication there and saw that the hospital was in the process of expanding. And so they're like, oh, okay, how does the owner talk with the accountant, the person who controls the purse strings? And so they basically waited and bought their time, and then they sent an email from the owner's account on behalf saying like, hey, all right, we're ready to move forward with our new radiology primary x-ray, but we need to wire them $40,000. And so the accountant, trying to think about this, it's a lot of money. Are you sure? Are you sure this is the right account? Everything's good. I'll get it wired today. They wrote back, yes, thank you for checking. I really appreciate it. Use similar acronyms and language that the owner would use in her other emails so that it sounded just like her. So the account was like, okay, cool. Boom, wired $40,000. Money's gone. Now they kept watching, and then they got greedy. And so like, okay, we got 40, let's try 90. And so they went back, and after a couple of months, and they're like, hey, now we need to wire $90,000 for this. And the accountant's like, this doesn't make sense. And she picks up the phone and calls the accountant. She's like, hey, I already wired the 40K, and now you want me to wire 90? Like, this doesn't make sense. And that's when the owner's like, what do you mean you wired $40,000? And so once the money's wired, it's gone. There's nothing we can do. So had there been some basic protections that we'll talk about later with their email account, would prevented them from getting in, and this generally never would have happened. So unfortunately, they lost $40,000 and they could never get it back. Luckily, the accountant was, at that time got a little suspicious and picked up the phone. We saw a North Carolina animal hospital when I first started the company. One of the first phone calls I got, guy was trying to sell his hospital to a corporate group. Basically, the short of it is the hackers got access to his Facebook account, saw he was doing some questionable personal things in his personal life based on the communication they found there. I don't know exactly what it was. They were going to then expose that data to all of the hospital's customers and to the potential buyer. The corporate group at that time was like, we don't want to deal with picking up the pieces. And so they basically walked out of the sale of the hospital, the purchase of it, because they're like, we're not going to pay these hackers. And if they do try to blackmail us by telling everybody, we don't want to try to recoup all of those customers that we might potentially lose. And so here was a guy that was ready to retire, and because he didn't take care of his social media accounts, lost the sale of his hospital. Arizona hospital, Albemarle Hospital, they thought they were backing up to the Covetrus backup service, where it's like kind of the cloud only backup. They got hit with ransomware when they went to recover. Unfortunately, they went to go to the data and pull their backups. And it was like, oh, it appears that these backups actually haven't been running for the last 6 months. So we can get you the data, but it's 6 months old. And so here's a hospital thought that they were somewhat protected, but really the backups weren't working, lost 6 months worth of data. New York ER hospital, this one was fascinating because they got hit 3 times, called us the 4th time they got hit. And they're like, we don't ever want to go through this again. And they had tape backups still. So they're still backing everything up to tape. Basically lost a year's worth of data because trying to recover from tape is just a bit of a nightmare. And then eventually they still didn't decide to really implement some basic things we thought, so they'd never have to deal with it. The problem is they keep paying. And so this is a great example of a hospital that keeps paying and they're a repeat target. So they've been hit 3 or 4 times now, and it's because they keep paying. And so they are now, their name is on the dark web that they will pay. So everybody will bide their time, and then they start going after this hospital specifically because they know that there's a good chance they're going to pay. The last one I think is really unique because when I first started the company, vet med was kind of seen as like, the kind of lumped into general human health as in general. So we share a lot of the same terms. And so it's kind of how we got lumped into a lot of these attacks. However, I'm sure if I asked, most of you are probably hiring. Well, hackers became aware of this. They're like, hey, this industry is always hiring. So the easiest way to take advantage of them is to send them a fake resume. And basically what had happened in this case is that, and this is the first time I really saw a direct targeted attack where it was like, hey, we're going after vet med specifically, was a fake associate resume. They emailed it to the practice manager. The practice manager went to open it. When they opened the resume, it basically deployed the ransomware, locked them out of everything, and kind of destroyed their network. And so there's some tools, again, that we'll talk about later, that you take 5 seconds out of your day, maybe 30 seconds in the most, you can scan these kind of files and kind of protect yourself. So I think there are 4 barriers that we as an industry need to overcome. One of these I don't think is a bad thing, but I think we just need to be more aware of it. So we just need to kind of overcome the challenges that it presents, but I don't think we necessarily need to change it. The first one is, almost 90% of all cyber attacks are a result of human error or behavior. So if we can just become more aware of these things, if we can start thinking about them, that's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck in general, because now we're aware of it. So we're going to be a little bit more skeptical, and we're maybe more or less likely to click on this, or more or less likely to do certain things. And so if we can kind of be aware of the just prevalence of cybercrime, we can knock down this kind of error or issue and behavior that then leads to cybercrime. This is the one that I think we don't necessarily need to change. So if we go back to when I talked earlier, and all my friends are like, hey, go into human health because they have to use you, like you'll make millions overnight. This was one where I was like, yeah, but the industry is filled with just trusting and empathetic practice owners. Like the people are amazing. All of my greatest friends are now in vet med, and I wouldn't change it for the world. And so it was like a big brother moment for me. I was like, sure, I may not have the opportunity to make as much, but I have an opportunity to really make a difference for people that I really care about, because they're just such amazing people. And so this isn't something I think we should change, because if this wasn't the case, I don't think I'd be in the industry. But even though as much as I love animals, but it's really the people in vet med that just make this industry so special. And so I think if we can just realize that we are very trusting and empathetic, and just become a little bit more skeptical with outsiders, this will go a long way in helping us prevent cyber attacks in our hospital. Number 3 is what we talked about a little bit earlier. Most practice owners and managers don't think that there's any data that a cyber criminal would want, right? They don't realize the value of their data. So if any of us are connected on LinkedIn, and if you saw the LinkedIn post, you probably saw my headline, my tagline, right? Helping veterinarians realize the value of their data and helping them to protect it. The thing is that data is more valuable than oil, and your data is extremely, extremely expensive. To give you an example, I think I saw last year the weirdest data set that I saw sold on the black market, sold for over $500,000. And it basically was elementary school student data from like 15 elementary schools on the East Coast of the United States. Why somebody would want that data, I have no idea, but it sold for over $500,000 on the black market. So now imagine how valuable your data is, because your practice management system and most of the data on your hospital is your entire business, right? Like it is everything about your business. And so if I can get that kind of information, what kind of value is there? And number 4, the last one is my IT guy has this covered. We see this one all the time, like with the other hospital. Hey, thought my data was backed up. Turns out it wasn't. My last data set was 6 months ago. And so generally this idea that like, oh no, I'm good, I don't need to worry about it. There's some basic things we can do to make sure, yeah, hey, IT guy, do you really have me covered? So to get away from all the doom and gloom, what are some things that we can do to help change this? So education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. It's a quote from Nelson Mandela. I think this is the first step, right? Just becoming more aware of this stuff, realizing that it is a problem in vet med, I think goes a long way in helping us to change not only the world, but the industry as a whole. A couple of key points only on this is that last year on June 3rd, the White House issued a letter to all businesses across the US, regardless of your size. And they said that there's 5 things that you should do to help stop yourself from being a target of cybercrime. And if we look at number 4, I think that's the most important, right? I think for me, it was like, I'm not the only one that's saying this. And so I think, and that's mostly why I include this. We'll talk about some of these other things in the 5 things that you can do. But yeah, number 4, testing your IT team's work. So even the United States government sees this is a massive problem across all businesses in the US, regardless of size. Ransomware Disclosure Act, I think, is just something you should be aware of. The Senator Warren is working with a few other senators to pass this act. I haven't seen any progress on it lately, so it might have died. But basically, the short of it is if you got hit with ransomware, there's a whole bunch of government red tape they wanted you to jump through and document. And I think this is terrible. Not a lot of people in the industry support it because it's like kind of shaming the victim, and that does no good. So how can we go about helping businesses across the US better protect themselves rather than when they're in a moment when they need help, right? It's like if you're really sick and you have an arrow in your chest, the government wants you to say, okay, tell us how long the arrow is, who feathered it, where did the arrowhead come from, like what specific type of metal it was. It's like, I don't care about any of that right now. I just need to get this arrow out of my chest so I can start to heal. It's essentially kind of what this does, and I just don't think it's very helpful. So hopefully it doesn't pass, but if it does, something we should be aware of, because it'll basically get hit with ransomware and you don't follow these steps, more fines and levies that you have to pay when you're already in a bad spot. So what are all these 5 things that keep promising you and telling you that are the easy things you can do so it's not all doom and gloom? The first one is passwords. I can't tell you how many hospitals, like if you are Cornerstone Hospital or Implement Hospital, I can probably tell you what most of your computer passwords are, right? So have you changed those things? Another interesting thing is, like, if I go in a new hospital and I just put my elbows on the counter and lean over and look at the reception computer, do you have all your passwords, sticky noted across the front of your computers? Like, probably not a good practice. How many of you, your password is the owner's dog, right? Like, these things are generally not a good idea. But the good news is that you can choose a password manager. Generally, I start with one internally for yourself, right? Learn how it works. And then it's super easy once you understand how great a password manager works. So, like, not only internally do we as a company have a password manager, I use a password manager personally, and somebody could hold a gun to my head and I could not tell you my bank password because it's 25 characters of random strings and numbers that I have no idea what it is. I don't think I think I looked at it once when it first suggested it, but I have no idea what it is. Other caveat from this is that most people say, well, like, oh, I'm using Google Chrome's password manager. Not a good idea. You're storing passwords in Google Chrome. Terrible idea. There are a number of compromises and tools out there that basically just scrape passwords from Google Chrome. And all you have to do is just visit the wrong website. So you could click on a link in a bad ad that maybe was compromised, maybe in your email. Just opening the web page, then it has access to Google Chrome. It will scrape those passwords, and all your passwords have now been compromised. So you need a good independent password manager that's encrypted. Generally, when you set these up, you create a master password that you should only use for this password manager that you've never used anywhere else. And most good password managers also, they cannot get access to your password. So if you lose your master password and then this secret key that they give you, they can't get it. It's gone forever because it's encrypted. So choosing a good password manager, I like 1Password, or there's a great open source free one called Bitwarden if you kind of want to just test the waters. Bitwarden will also be a software so you can set it up on your own servers. You can set up internally. The other thing that you should do is enable 2FA for all critical accounts. When we talked about that hospital that lost $40,000, if they had 2FA, which is two-form factor authentication, enabled on their email account, they wouldn't have been able to get into this account. So basically, like with your bank, like banks pretty much require it. So if you log in from a new computer, it's like, hey, they text you that code. That's 2FA, or what we call two-form factor authentication. Enable that wherever you can. They say that 2FA generally will stop about 75% of attacks. A perfect example of this is I'm somebody who thinks about cybersecurity every day. I had a friend who was working on another project. We were working on another project together. I'm actually at the airport on my way to go speak about this stuff at a conference. And he sends me an email. And I'm at the airport, I'm connected to my hotspot. I'm trying to be smart about this. And he sends me this email like, hey, we're working on this project together. Can you take a look at this document? So I click on the document. It asks for my basically Office 365 credentials. And so I key the credentials in. Don't think anything out of it because I'm like, yeah, it's secure information. It's for, it should be encrypted or whatever. Log in. And then it's just a general blank document. I'm like, what the heck? Well, all of a sudden on my cell phone, I start getting a bunch of text messages from Microsoft saying like, hey, here's your code for your 2FA code to log in your Office account. At that moment, I realized he had been compromised. They watched how we communicated. They sent me something that I knew I was likely to click on to try to get access to. because they used his wording and his, the way he talked pretty much verbatim, and they tried to, and basically it compromised me. Now, because I had 2FA, I know immediately that basically they were phishing me. I changed my password and I was done. They never had access to my account because they never had the code. And I was also immediately alerted. So I think about this stuff all day, every day. And if I can get caught up in something like that because of how sophisticated they are, think about your receptionist who's juggling 20 people at once. Maybe if you're still doing curbside stuff, right? Like trying to answer the phone, trying to check people out, trying to get the dogs through, like how are they going to be able to catch it? So it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how much you think about it. Anybody can become a victim. And there's basic things like 2FA that can really help prevent attacks. Update, update, and update again. This is something that I think it's 100% free. So update your underlying any software you can update, with the exception of like your practice management system. If you're a Cornerstone or Impromed user or something like that, they generally don't include a lot of security updates. Sometimes they do. Like I think Cornerstone just changed how the whole password functionality worked. So sometimes there is additional security updates there, but generally if you can update the computers, it's free. Update your phone, all that jazz. And it's 100% free. Here's some free tools. And at the end, you don't have to memorize these because I have a free ebook you can download. There's a QR code that will walk you through all these so you don't have to remember them. Blacklight will tell you what a website's tracking about you. If there's anything out of the ordinary, what is it doing? Have I been pwned? Well, basically you put in your email address. It will tell you if it's ever been compromised. You can also, there's another password field, so you don't key them in together. It will tell you if your passwords have been compromised and if you should change those passwords. Virus total. We talked earlier about that hospital that got on the resume. Any file I get from anybody, I will run through virus total. Even though I have additional tools that I will run, I basically drag and drop it from an email in virus total. It'll scan it against, I think, like 50 different virus engines and tell me if the file's corrupted. It's 100% free and it takes about 15 seconds. So this would have saved that Oregon hospital from getting ransomware because it would have caught the file. Staff training. So I think this is the most important thing you can do, is basically, does your staff feel comfortable to come to you in the event they make a mistake? The biggest thing that we see is most people, when they make a mistake, they try to sweep it under the rug. So because they don't want to, they don't feel safe coming to management or ownership to say, hey, I feel like I got caught in something, and they try to cover their tracks, and then it just makes things far worse. So if you get anything from this, this is probably the most important. Does your staff feel safe to come to you in the event that they make a mistake? Because if they do, we can greatly minimize the damages the quicker you can react and act in these kind of events, and it will save you thousands and thousands of dollars basically just by having this in place, because you can take immediate action. If they try to sweep it under the rug, it is going to be an absolute nightmare and disaster, and it's just only going to make things worse. So this is probably the biggest thing you can do for free, and it's just, does your staff feel comfortable to come to you in the event that they make a mistake? And this training doesn't necessarily include, like, do they understand the latest cyber attacks? It's basically like, hey, what kind of culture do we have in the hospital? Are we working in a place where we're allowed to make mistakes and learn from them? That's more than anything. So not the idea that necessarily we need to train people on the latest cyber attacks, which can help, but I think this is far more important. And last but not least, because I know we're out of time here, is backups. A couple of things to think about is, how often is your data backed up? Because if you have to go to a data, if you have to rely on a backup plan, basically it's like, how much data are you willing to lose? So you need to think about, if you were to lose your practice management system, how much data are you willing to lose out of there in the event you have to go to your backups? Where is it backed up to? Is it somewhere ransomware proof safe? Is it safe from hackers? Because the first thing they're going to do is they're going to delete your backups, because they know that backups will make it so they can't pay you. And how fast can you recover? So depending upon the backup type, you may have backups, but you may live in a rural county where you're downloading at 1 megabyte per second, and you have a 250 gigabyte database, and it's going to take 2 weeks to download that thing. So these are the things you really need to think about in your backup sets. When you're analyzing it, do they really meet your business needs? So that being said, this is my contact info. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. This is a QR code that will take you to an ebook that I worked really hard on to make super pretty on how to use all these tools that you can get 100% free. Please download it, use it, share it with your friends, because the more we can get it out there, the better that we can help everybody. So that's it. Thank you for the time.
My friend, thank you so much. It's so interesting. Probably not a lot of people know this, but I used to live in Clint's world and had a managed service provider company many moons ago. And the current state of technology in general just scares the pants off me. Um, a lot of really great information. If there was one thing that you had to recommend people after watching this do right away, what would the one thing be?
One thing, yeah, staff culture and training, I think is probably the most important. That's probably the biggest. That's really hard though, right? Because if you're not intentional about culture, culture will build itself. So that's not something you necessarily change overnight if you don't have that in place. So the easiest thing you could probably do, I think, is just update. Like
Yeah,
most
I think
hospitals.
so. And the thing that I wanted to pull out there is, we're going to upload this on YouTube, send it out to your staff, get them to watch it at a lunch break.
Yeah,
I mean, there's so much information in here that will help everybody that works in your clinic in their personal life, but also in their professional life. And having some level of awareness of these things, whether it's passwords or not having the passwords on the sticky note or taped to the keyboard or, God forbid, on the wall. These make a big difference. And I think it is all about that educational piece. And we share a friend, a host that, or also a presenter that's been on this webinar series, Josh, and he talks a lot about that psychological safety. And that's what you're getting at, is like, make people comfortable to tell you if they've made a mistake, because man, oh man, is it ever easier to deal with it if you know it happened.
exactly. Yep, absolutely. 100%. Yep. Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
no,
like
it's the information in here, like the password manager, all of the simple little things that are fairly simple. Like once you set them up, they make a ton of sense. Now, a shameless self plug for Clint. If you don't know this stuff, if you don't have somebody to help you with this stuff, that's exactly what Clint does. And you've got his email address in front of you. Feel free to reach out to him. I have several clinics to talk to that we've referred to Clint. We've referred other companies to work with Clint. I've seen him speak, and I know he knows his stuff. So if you have questions, please reach out to Clint. And thanks for joining us. Clint, thanks for being here.
yeah, of course. No, thanks for having me. It was great. And yeah, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can.
Well, have a great day, my friend, and see you in Chicago.
Yeah, see you next week. It'll be great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.